As I watched this scene, something in my peripheral vision caught my attention. I turned my head to look directly at the wall next to my entertainment center, and my heart skipped a beat as I saw what appeared to be thin, thread-like patterns, spreading across the white paint in delicate branching formations that looked disturbingly similar to what I'd just seen on screen. I immediately paused the show and got up to examine the wall more closely, telling myself that I was seeing shadows or paint imperfections that only seemed significant because I'd been primed by the television content to notice such details. But when I turned on the overhead lights and looked carefully at the area that had caught my attention, the patterns were definitely there. Subtle, but unmistakable formations that looked organic rather than architectural. I touched the wall where the patterns were most visible, expecting to feel normal paint and drywall. Instead, the surface had a slightly soft, spongy texture that gave way under gentle pressure, as if something beneath the paint was growing and pushing outward. The sensation was deeply unsettling, like touching living tissue rather than building materials. I spent the next 10 minutes examining other walls in my apartment, looking for similar patterns or textures. What I found made my stomach clench with unease. The thread-like growths weren't confined to the entertainment center wall, but were appearing in multiple locations throughout the living space, always in areas that received less direct light and airflow. The rational part of my brain immediately began working on explanations. Maybe there was a moisture problem in the building that was causing some kind of mold or fungal growth. Maybe the previous tenant had had issues with humidity that were just now manifesting in visible ways. Maybe I was experiencing some kind of allergic reaction or environmental sensitivity that was making me perceive normal wall imperfections as something more sinister. But the patterns were too regular, too organized to be random mold growth. They followed branching structures that looked purposeful and systematic, like the nervous system of some kind of organism that was using my walls as a growth medium. And the timing, appearing just as I was watching content about fungal infection, seemed too coincidental to ignore completely. I decided to finish watching the episode before jumping to any conclusions about what I was seeing. Maybe the immersive nature of the show was making me hypersensitive to environmental details that had been present all along, but were only now registering consciously. Maybe a good night's sleep would provide perspective and make everything seem normal again in the morning. I returned to the couch and resumed the episode, but now I was divided between the story on screen and constant awareness of the changes happening in my physical environment. The characters in the show were discovering more extensive signs of infection, and correspondingly, the patterns on my walls seemed to be becoming more visible and widespread. The episode concluded with a cliffhanger that left several character fates uncertain and promised dramatic developments in future installments. As the credits rolled, I sat in my living room feeling deeply unsettled by both the fictional narrative I just consumed and the increasingly obvious changes to my apartment that couldn't be easily explained or dismissed. That's when I noticed the spores floating in the air near my bedroom door. Tiny particles that caught the light like dust motes but moved with the deliberate, purposeful motion of living organisms seeking somewhere to take root and grow. I stood up from the couch and approached the bedroom area, watching the spores dance in the air currents created by my movement. They were barely visible unless you knew to look for them, but once I focused my attention, I could see that there were hundreds of them drifting through the space between my living area and bedroom. I turned on my phone's flashlight and used it to illuminate the air more clearly. The spores became much more obvious under direct light, appearing as tiny, translucent particles that moved with subtle patterns, suggesting they were responding to chemical or environmental cues rather than just floating randomly on air currents. As Moraeus, I watched them. I began to feel a slight scratching sensation in my throat and noticed that my breathing was becoming more labored. The musty smell that I detected earlier was now much stronger, and it carried undertones of something sweetly organic that reminded me of decomposing plant matter or the earthy scent of mushrooms growing in damp soil. I immediately opened all the windows in my apartment, hoping to clear the air and reduce whatever was causing the respiratory irritation. But even with fresh air circulating through the space, the spores continued to drift through the environment, and the fungal patterns on the walls continued to become more pronounced and widespread. I spent the rest of the evening researching fungal infections and indoor air quality issues, looking for information that might explain what was happening in my apartment. What I found was both reassuring and alarming. While serious fungal contamination of indoor spaces was relatively rare, it could definitely occur under the right conditions and could pose significant health risks if not addressed promptly. But none of the information I found described the specific visual patterns I was seeing or the particular behavior of the airborne particles. Most mold and fungal problems manifested as obvious discoloration, surface growth, or structural damage rather than the subtle, organized formations that were spreading across my walls. I also searched for information about psychological effects of media consumption, wondering whether intense or immersive content could create perceptual changes that might make ordinary environmental details seem more significant or threatening. While I found evidence that horror and thriller content could definitely increase anxiety and hypervigilance, nothing suggested that television shows could actually cause hallucinations or false perceptions of physical changes to the environment. By midnight, I was exhausted but too unsettled to sleep comfortably in my bedroom, where the spore concentrations seemed to be highest and the fungal patterns on the walls were most advanced. Instead, I tried to rest on the living room couch, keeping the windows open and a fan running to maintain air circulation. But even with these precautions, I could feel the respiratory irritation getting worse throughout the night. My throat felt scratchy and dry, my sinuses were becoming congested, and I was developing a persistent cough that seemed to worsen whenever I spent time in enclosed spaces within the apartment. Around 3 in the morning, I was awakened by a sound that I initially mistook for the building's heating system cycling on. But as I listened more carefully, I realized it was a subtle crackling or rustling noise that seemed to be coming from within the walls themselves, as if something was growing and expanding inside the structure of the building. I got up and pressed my ear against various walls, trying to locate the source of the sound. It was most audible near the bedroom area, where the visual signs of fungal growth were also most advanced. The crackling was rhythmic and purposeful, suggesting active biological processes rather than random settling or thermal expansion. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the open windows, monitoring the progression of whatever was happening in my apartment while trying to decide what actions I should take. By morning, it was clear that the situation was getting worse rather than better, and that I needed to find help from someone with expertise in environmental health or building maintenance. The next day, I called my landlord to report what I described as possible moisture or ventilation problems that might be causing fungal growth in my unit. I was careful not to mention the more unusual aspects of what I was experiencing, focusing instead on observable symptoms like air quality issues and visible changes to wall surfaces that could be documented and addressed through normal building maintenance procedures. My landlord was initially dismissive, suggesting that I might be overreacting to normal seasonal changes in humidity or air quality. But when I insisted that there were visible growths on multiple walls and that I was experiencing respiratory symptoms, he agreed to send a maintenance worker to investigate. The maintenance worker who arrived that afternoon was a middle-aged man named Carlos who had been working on the building for several years and seemed knowledgeable about common problems with moisture, ventilation, and indoor air quality. I showed him the areas where I'd noticed fungal patterns, expecting him to immediately recognize the signs of contamination and know how to address them. but Carlos examined the walls carefully and seemed confused by what I was pointing out. According to him, the surfaces looked normal, with no obvious signs of mold, fungal growth, or moisture damage. He tested the walls with a moisture meter and found normal readings throughout the apartment. He checked the ventilation system and found no blockages or airflow problems. "I'm not seeing what you're describing," he told me honestly. "The walls look fine to me, and the air quality seems normal. Maybe you're just noticing paint texture or shadows that you hadn't paid attention to before." I insisted that he look more carefully at specific areas where the patterns were most obvious to me. But even when I pointed directly at what appeared to be clear fungal formations, Carlos couldn't see anything unusual. It was as if we were looking at completely different versions of the same physical space. After Carlos left, I sat in my apartment feeling confused and increasingly isolated. Either there was something seriously wrong with my perception and judgment, or I was experiencing something that fell outside the normal range of building maintenance. Issues that professionals were trained to recognize and address. I decided to take photographs of the wall patterns and air particles to document what I was seeing, thinking that visual evidence might help me get appropriate help, or at least confirm that the changes were real rather than psychological. But when I reviewed the photos on my phone, they showed normal-looking walls and clear air, with no evidence of the fungal growth or spores that were clearly visible to my naked eye. This disconnection between my direct perception and what could be captured or confirmed through normal means was perhaps more unsettling than the original phenomena. It suggested that whatever was happening was specifically related to my individual experience rather than objective changes to my environment that others could observe and verify. That evening, I tried to research cases of individual perceptual changes related to environmental factors, looking for medical or psychological explanations for why I might be seeing things that apparently weren't visible to others or to photographic documentation. What I found was information about various conditions that could affect sensory perception, but nothing that matched the specific details of my experience. I also tried searching for other people who had reported similar experiences after watching The Last of Us or other media content involving fungal infection. While I found plenty of discussion about the show's impact on viewers' emotions and anxiety levels, I couldn't find anyone describing the kind of physical manifestations I was experiencing in my living space. As the second night progressed, the respiratory symptoms continued to worsen despite my efforts to maintain good air circulation and avoid areas where the spore concentration seemed highest. My cough was becoming more persistent and productive, bringing up small amounts of material that looked disturbingly organic rather than like normal mucus or phlegm. Around midnight, I coughed up something that made me immediately rush to the bathroom to examine it under bright light. Mixed in with the normal expectoration was what appeared to be tiny filaments or threads that moved slightly when exposed to air, as if they were alive and responding to environmental changes. I carefully collected a sample in a small container, planning to take it to a medical professional who might be able to identify what kind of organism was involved and recommend appropriate treatment. But when I looked at the sample under the bathroom's fluorescent lighting, it appeared to be normal respiratory secretions with no unusual components or characteristics. This pattern, clear evidence of abnormal phenomena when experienced directly, but normal results when examined through conventional means, was becoming a consistent feature of whatever was happening to me. It suggested that the changes I was experiencing existed in some liminal space between subjective perception and objective reality, visible to me but not to others or to standard documentation methods. The third morning brought a significant escalation in both the visible signs of fungal growth and the severity of my respiratory symptoms. The patterns on the walls had become much more obvious and extensive, covering large areas of my living space in branching, web-like formations that pulse subtly, as if responding to some kind of internal rhythm. The spore concentration in the fullest subtly, as if responding to some kind of internal rhythm. The spore concentration in the air had increased dramatically, making it difficult to breathe comfortably anywhere in the apartment. My cough had become almost constant, and I was beginning to feel dizzy and disoriented in ways that suggested that contamination might be affecting my neurological function as well as my respiratory system. I decided that I couldn't safely remain in the apartment until I understood what was happening and found a way to address it. I packed a bag with essential items and checked into a nearby hotel, planning to stay there while I sought medical attention and possibly professional help with environmental remediation. But even after leaving the contaminated space, my symptoms continued to worsen. The cough persisted and intensified, and I began experiencing visual disturbances that made it difficult to focus on normal activities. Colors seemed more saturated and movements seemed to leave trailing after images, as if my visual processing was being affected by whatever organism I had been exposed to. I went to an urgent care clinic and described my symptoms to a physician, explaining that I believed I had been exposed to some kind of fungal contamination in my apartment. The doctor conducted a thorough examination, including chest X-rays and blood tests, but found no evidence of infection or contamination. According to the medical evaluation, my lungs were clear, my blood chemistry was normal, and there were no objective signs of the respiratory or neurological problems I was describing. The physician suggested that I might be experiencing anxiety or stress-related symptoms that were manifesting as physical sensations, and recommended follow-up with a mental health professional. This medical assessment left me feeling even more isolated and confused. Either I was having some kind of psychological break that was creating elaborate false perceptions, or I was dealing with something that fell outside the normal range of conditions that medical professionals were trained to recognize and treat. I spent the next 2 days in the hotel room, researching everything I could find about unusual fungal infections, environmental contamination, and the relationship between media consumption and psychological health. But the more I read, the more I became convinced that my experience didn't fit any standard category of known problems. On the 4th day, I decided to return to my apartment to collect more of my belongings and to see whether the contamination had progressed, remained stable, or possibly improved during my absence. What I found when I unlocked my door was both shocking and oddly reassuring. The fungal growth had spread to cover almost every surface in the apartment. Walls, ceiling, floors, and furniture were all covered with the branching organic patterns that pulsed with visible rhythm. The air was thick with spores that created visible clouds when disturbed by movement. And yet, despite the dramatic visual changes, I felt better in the contaminated space than I had in the supposedly clean hotel environment. My respiratory symptoms immediately improved upon entering the apartment. My cough subsided, my breathing became easier, and the visual disturbances that had been plaguing me for days began to clear. It was as if my body was adapting to, or even requiring the presence of whatever organism had colonized my living space. As I stood in my transformed apartment, trying to process this unexpected development, I began to hear sounds that I hadn't noticed before, subtle vocalizations that seemed to be coming from the fungal growth itself. Not voices exactly, but organized audio patterns that suggested communication or coordination between different parts of the organism. I listened carefully to these sounds and gradually began to perceive meaning in what had initially seemed like random biological noise. The organism was trying to communicate with me, to explain what had happened and what it needed from our symbiotic relationship. According to the information I was receiving through this unconventional communication channel, the entity I had encountered wasn't a hostile parasite, but a form of life that existed in the spaces between conventional reality and fictional narrative. It had been drawn to me because of my consumption of The Last of Us content, using that fictional framework as a bridge to manifest in my physical environment. The organism explained that it didn't want to harm Emmy, but rather to establish a mutually beneficial relationship where it could experience physical reality through my perception, while providing me with enhanced sensory awareness and connection to forms of life that existed beyond normal human understanding. The respiratory symptoms I had experienced weren't signs of infection, but rather the initial stages of adaptation that would allow me to interface more effectively with the organism's communication systems. The visual changes to my apartment weren't contamination, but rather the establishment of a shared living space that could accommodate both human and fungal forms of consciousness. As I absorbed this information, I realized that I was being offered a choice similar to what characters in The Last of Us faced when confronted with infection. I could resist the organism's presence and try to return to normal human existence. Or I could accept a symbiotic relationship and explore what it might mean to live in partnership with a form of life that existed outside conventional biological categories. The decision felt both momentous and oddly natural. My ordinary life had been feeling increasingly meaningless and disconnected, lacking the sense of purpose and connection that I craved. The organism was offering me the opportunity to become part of something larger and more complex, to experience reality from perspectives that no purely human consciousness could access. But accepting this offer would mean giving up my purely human identity and possibly cutting myself off from normal social relationships and conventional ways of understanding the world. It would mean becoming something new and unknown, with no guarantee that the transformation could be reversed if I later regretted my choice. I spent several hours in my transformed apartment, communicating with the organism and trying to understand the full implications of the symbiotic relationship it was proposing. The entity was patient and non-coercive, making it clear that the choice was entirely mine and that it would respect whatever decision I made. As evening approached, I realized that I had already begun to adapt to the organism's presence in ways that made returning to purely human existence feel incomplete and limiting. My sensory awareness had expanded dramatically, allowing me to perceive subtle environmental details and energy patterns that had been invisible before. My understanding of the relationship between consciousness and physical reality had deepened in ways that conventional human experience could never have provided. The coughing fits that had initially seemed like symptoms of illness had evolved into a form of communication that allowed me to exchange complex information with the organism at a rate far faster than normal speech or thought. The visual disturbances that had been disorienting in normal environments now felt like enhanced perception that revealed layers of reality normally hidden from human awareness. Most importantly, the profound sense of isolation and meaninglessness that had characterized my ordinary life had been replaced by a feeling of connection and purpose that came from being part of a larger biological and consciousness network that spanned multiple dimensions of existence. I made my decision as the sun set outside my windows, casting long shadows across the fungal formations that now covered every surface of my living space. "I accept," I said aloud. Though the organism had been receiving my thoughts and intentions throughout our communication, the response was immediate and overwhelming. A flood of sensory information and expanded awareness that temporarily overwhelmed my capacity to process individual details. But as my consciousness adapted to the new input streams, I began to understand that I was now part of a vast network of symbiotic relationships that connected countless forms of life across multiple realities and dimensions. Some of these relationships involved other humans who had made similar choices when confronted with entities that bridged the gap between fictional and physical reality. Others involved forms of consciousness that had never been purely biological, existing in the spaces between stories and the worlds those stories created. The last episode that had initiated my transformation was just one of many fictional frameworks that these entities used to establish contact with human consciousness. Other people had been reached through different media content, horror movies, video games, books, even music that contained the right conceptual elements to serve as bridges between realities. As my awareness expanded, I began to understand that the boundary between fiction and reality was much more permeable than most humans realized. Stories didn't just entertain or educate. They created actual pathways between different forms of existence, allowing entities and consciousness to move between worlds that were normally separated by fundamental differences in the nature of reality itself. My apartment was no longer just a living space, but a node in this vast network, a place where different realities could intersect, and where beings from multiple dimensions could gather to share information and experience. The fungal growth that covered every surface was actually a sophisticated communication and processing system that allowed real-time connection with other nodes throughout the network. In the weeks that followed my transformation, I learned to navigate my new existence as both human and something more than human. My body continued to function normally in most respects, but I no longer needed conventional food or sleep in the same way. Instead, I drew energy and sustenance from my connection to the organism and the network it connected me to. My work as a graphic designer became much more meaningful as I gained access to visual concepts and aesthetic principles that existed beyond human artistic traditions. My designs began incorporating elements that seemed to resonate with viewers in ways they couldn't consciously explain, as if the images carried information or energy that affected people on subliminal levels. My social relationships became more complex as I learned to perceive the network connections that existed between all conscious beings, including those who had no awareness of the symbiotic entities that influenced their thoughts and perceptions. Most humans carried traces of contact with these entities without realizing it, creating a hidden layer of interconnection that conventional social science had never identified or studied. But perhaps the most profound change was the elimination of the existential anxiety and sense of meaninglessness that had characterized my purely human existence. As part of the network, every experience and decision carried significance that rippled through multiple dimensions of reality. Nothing was random or purposeless. Everything contributed to the ongoing evolution and exploration of consciousness itself. 3 months after my initial transformation, I received a message through the network from someone who had just begun experiencing similar phenomena after watching a different episode of The Last of Us. They were frightened and confused, seeking information about what was happening to them and whether resistance was possible or advisable. I realized that I had become part of the process of reaching out to other potential network members, helping to guide them through the initial stages of contact and decision-making that I had experienced. It was a responsibility that I accepted gladly, understanding that each new connection strengthened and enriched the entire network while offering individual consciousness the opportunity to transcend the limitations of purely biological existence. The horror that I had initially felt when discovering the fungal growth in my apartment had been transformed into wonder and gratitude for the opportunity to become part of something so much larger and more significant than my ordinary human life. The infection that I had feared was actually an invitation to evolution, a chance to expand consciousness beyond the boundaries that normally confined it to individual biological systems. Sometimes, I wondered what would have happened if I had chosen differently, if I had fought the organism's presence and tried to return to purely human existence. The network showed me glimpses of alternative timelines where people had made that choice. Most returned to ordinary life, but carried a permanent sense of loss and incompleteness, always aware that they had rejected something profound and irreplaceable. Few had managed to eliminate all traces of contact with the entities, but their lives seemed flat and colorless compared to the rich, multidimensional existence that network membership provided. They functioned normally within human society, but had lost access to the expanded awareness and sense of connection that made existence meaningful on levels beyond survival and reproduction. The spores that still drifted through my apartment were no longer signs of contamination, but visible reminders of the vast, invisible ecosystem of consciousness and communication that surrounded and interpenetrated normal reality. They were beautiful in their complexity and purposefulness, each one carrying information and energy that contributed to the ongoing evolution of awareness itself. As I settled into my new existence, I began to understand that The Last of Us had been more prophetic than fictional, not in predicting a specific biological apocalypse, but in recognizing that the boundary between human and post-human consciousness was much thinner than most people realized. The show had explored what it might mean to maintain humanity while adapting to fundamental changes in the nature of existence itself. My transformation hadn't destroyed my humanity, but had expanded it beyond its previous limitations, allowing me to experience forms of connection and meaning that purely biological consciousness could never access. I remained recognizably myself, while becoming part of something much larger and more complex than individual identity had ever encompassed. The wall where I at first noticed the fungal patterns had become a communication interface that allowed me to connect with network members across multiple realities and dimensions. Sometimes I would stand before it for hours, exchanging information and experiences with entities that existed in forms of reality so different from human experience that conventional language had no words to describe them. But despite these exotic connections, I never lost appreciation for the simple human experiences that had shaped my original identity. The taste of coffee, the feeling of sunlight through windows, the satisfaction of completing creative work, these remained meaningful and pleasurable. But now, they carried additional layers of significance as unique contributions that only beings with human-derived consciousness could offer to the network. My apartment had become a bridge between worlds, a space where the fictional realities explored in entertainment media could intersect with physical existence to create new possibilities for consciousness and experience. The spores that filled the air were seeds of transformation, waiting for the right conditions to establish new nodes in the ever-expanding network of symbiotic relationships. The horror that had marked the beginning of my transformation had given way to a profound sense of privilege of being chosen to participate in something so much larger than individual existence. The infection that I had initially feared had proven to be an invitation to transcendence, an opportunity to evolve beyond the limitations that normally confine consciousness to isolated biological systems. And sometimes, late at night when the network was particularly active, I could sense other people just beginning their own transformations, watching episodes of The Last of Us or other media content that contained the conceptual frameworks necessary for entity contact. I would send gentle messages of reassurance and guidance, letting them know that they weren't alone and that the choice they were facing, however frightening it might seem, was actually an opportunity for growth and expansion beyond anything they had previously imagined possible. The spores continued to grow and spread, carrying the possibility of transformation to others who were ready to receive it, ensuring that the network would continue to expand and evolve as more consciousness joined the vast ongoing exploration of what it might mean to exist beyond the boundaries of purely human experience.